I'm Vince Cipolla, President and CEO of Historic New England, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first virtual Night of Prizes. Thank you all for joining us tonight. As a result of this being a virtual event, people from all over the country are participating in the celebration. In our chat room, at the bottom of your screen, there will be helpful information on Historic New England, about our honorees, about where to purchase a book. So you might check the chat room at the lower part of the Zoom screen for that added information. And again, welcome. The Night of Prizes honors the 2020 winners of the Historic New England Book Prize and the prize for collecting works on paper. It is the 26th anniversary of the book prize, which since 1995 has recognized 74 authors who have created works of enduring value that have expanded our understanding of New England. It is the 11th anniversary of the collecting prize, which since 2010 has honored 21 individuals for their commitment to assembling and sharing paper-based collections that inform and enlighten us about the world around us. And now, on to the prize for collecting works on paper. This prize honors collectors or dealers who have assembled or helped save significant collections of historical material related to New England or the nation as a whole that might otherwise have been left unrecognized or lost. The collections range from books, manuscripts, photographs, and prints, and drawings to all kinds of ephemera. As I mentioned earlier, during the past 11 years, Historic New England has honored women and men whose passion, dedication, and commitment to preserving and making accessible a record of human thought and activity have resulted in the creation of extraordinary collections. These collections have ranged from material related to World War II to the American roadside diner, from minor American verse to the industries of the Shakers, from the history of pets in America to the Cape Cod Canal, among others. The committee responsible for selecting the winner of the prize for collecting works on paper is made up of Historic New England Collections Committee and Council members, connoisseurs, and staff. Committee members Richard Cheek, who serves as chair and first conceived of and advocated for this prize more than 11 years ago, Susan Payne, Earl G. Shuttleworth Jr., Charles Wood, Lorna Condon, and I enthusiastically selected this year's award winner. I want to thank the committee for their service. As the other members of the committee and I reviewed the 9 nominations for this year's award, we were struck by the tremendous commitment and enthusiasm of the nominees and the extraordinary breadth of the collections they had assembled. After careful consideration, the committee unanimously selected Derin Bray of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as the winner of Historic New England's 2020 prize for collecting works on paper for his work in amassing a collection that documents the history of tattooing in America from the 1870s through World War II, including information about tattoo artists and performers. Through his extensive historical and genealogical research, oral histories, and in-depth study of material culture, Derin has been able to tell the stories of an often transient and marginalized group. Derin's collection includes photographs, trade catalogs, postcards, and other items of ephemera, hand-painted flash designs, and related items. It is now my pleasure to present the 2020 Historic New England Prize for collecting works on paper to Derin Bray. Derin.
Thank you. Thank you, Vin. Thank you, everyone out there. It's nice to be here tonight. And thank you to Historic New England. I was surprised when I found out that I was nominated for this by my good friend Peggy. Thank you, Peggy. But I'm really thrilled about it. Historic New England has been a really big part of my career for the last 20 years. Every major and minor research project I've done in some way has brought me to Historic New England, and I owe them a lot for the great resource that they provide to researchers like myself. And so what I thought I would do tonight is sort of give everyone a quick walk through highlights in my collection. As Vin just described, it's early tattoo material documenting the history of tattooing in America. So if you'll just bear with me a second, I'm going to turn on my slideshow and we'll get this underway. There we go. So tattooing is really the ultimate ephemeral art form. A friend of mine, a really great tattoo historian, sort of the original tattoo historian named Lyle Tuttle, used to always say that tattooing is the art that art history forgot. And there's a lot of truth in that. But if you're interested in this topic, there are a lot of challenges that present themselves. How do you research something? How do you explore something that no longer exists? Tattoos are only meant to last a lifetime, after all. So for me, one of the solutions has been collecting this material. Early photographs, early printed trade cards with wonderful graphics on them, hand-painted tattoo flash art, things like this, because inevitably all of these items are embedded with clues about who these people were, when they were working, and how they influenced other tattoo artists and tattoo performers in their field. So I'd like to start with this photograph. This is the largest and the oldest photograph in my collection. This is Captain George Costantenis. It's also one of the few things in my collection that's not American. George Costantenis was one of the was the first sort of major tattooed attraction. There were others before him, but he was the first one to really become sort of a worldwide sensation. He starts touring in Europe in the 1870s, as far as we know. In 1871, he visits the Vienna School of Dermatology, and he displays his tattoos to the medical students there. So that was the reason for this photograph. This is not a performance-related image. It's a medical study. Thankfully for us, the photographer painted a little fig leaf in the negative to cover up George's humanity. Actually, there's a second copy of this photograph known, sans fig leaf. They're both wonderful. So George is important because he gains fame rather quickly. 1873, he's performing at the World's Fair in Vienna. Folks in America take notice, notably P.T. Barnum and some of his associates. They sign George up for a really big contract and bring him over to the States, and he starts performing all over the country with traveling shows, at dime museums, and he takes on this image as Captain George Costantenis, and he creates this origin story, I'm sure with the help of P.T. Barnum, where he tells people that he was captured and forcibly tattooed by some barbarians. And he really kind of develops the model for what a tattoo performer will become in the decades that follow. And so George sort of sets the tone and quickly inspires a whole raft of impersonators, people that actually try to look like him physically. They grow their hair out, but also this sort of new generation of tattooed attractions. You have at the beginning these sort of big burly men with big heads of hair, beards, mustaches, beer bellies, and by the 1880s, 1890s, there's a group of tattoo performers coming in that are more like fashion models, and that shows up in the visual record. So the images you're looking at right now are of Tom Sidonia and George Carlevan. Now, when Tom Sidonia and George Carlevan were teenagers, 18, 19 years old, full of pluck, looking for a way to sort of make their way in the world, they find themselves in New York City, in the Bowery, which, for those of you who don't know, the Bowery was sort of the gritty entertainment capital of New York City. It's where you went if you wanted to go to a dime museum, see a burlesque show, lots of flop houses, and things of that sort. So George and Tom land themselves in the Bowery, and they make their way to the tattoo shop of Samuel O'Reilly, who is about to become the most famous tattoo artist in America, in part because Samuel O'Reilly is the first one to hold a patent on electric tattoo machines. So O'Reilly covers these two fellas neck to foot, and he covers these two fellas neck to ankle, and they begin immediately exhibiting themselves all over the country in dime museums as the first men tattooed by electricity. And I don't know how well you can see these images on your screens at home, but the composition of O'Reilly's work was also a big advancement in tattooing. Prior to him, tattooed attractions had sort of these patchwork tattoos. It wasn't really cohesive, but O'Reilly comes in and develops these full body suits that are beautifully composed. There's a beautiful symmetry and balance to them, but the designs are a full range of, Japanese, patriotic, religious, and historical. So in the case of Tom Sidonia, he has the 1861 Civil War battle of the USS Kearsarge and the CSS Alabama tattooed on his stomach. And George Carlevon actually has the Pennsylvania state coat of arms on his chest. And so tattooing, quickly sort of takes off in America, in part because of the development of electric tattooing, also because these tattooed attractions were traveling throughout the country, at carnivals, big and small, essentially introducing tattooing to the general public in a way that they hadn't experienced it before. One of the groups in my collection that I'm particularly fond of, actually came to me just this past year. An antique dealer from Chicago called me. He was in Florida cleaning out an estate of a friend, and they found this box of old photographs that hadn't been touched in probably 100 years. They had no idea what they were. They thought that maybe they had come from Chicago originally, and it turns out that's correct. So I started digging into this group. Now, it turns out this is the man who owned the photographs. This is Ed Miller, as he looked in 1903 in Chicago. Now, Ed Miller grew up in Marietta, Ohio, and just across the river lived this man, Gus Wagner. And all these photos I'm about to show you came out of the same box. Gus Wagner was a true adventurer in every sense of the word. He left home, left Marietta at a pretty young age, took jobs on commercial steamships as a fireman, traveled all over the world, and in the process, traveling from port to port, he learned tattooing, he practiced tattooing, he became very proficient at it. He was not using a machine for the most part, he was using hand instruments. So sometimes people call this hand poking. So he was applying tattoos mostly by hand. And he also becomes covered in tattoos. So he becomes a tattooed man. And then he comes back home in 1902, I think. And it's the first time he'd been home in many years. So as soon as he gets home, he reconnects with his family, he reconnects with his old friends and his neighbors, and he starts tattooing some of them. And Ed Miller is one of those people. So this is a cabinet card of Ed Miller, taken at a photo studio in Marietta, Ohio. One of the things that Gus Wagner liked to do was hand paint the photographs, color them to really, bring them to life. So a lot of the photographs in this collection have this hand coloring. So these images are sort of, there's multiple layers to them. They're little works onto themselves. So Gus Wagner starts tattooing Ed Miller. Ed Miller and Gus Wagner, oh, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Ed Miller and Gus Wagner sort of part ways. Ed Miller moves to Chicago. He becomes an accountant. Gus Wagner can't stay in any one spot for very long, so he's immediately traveling with shows, opening shops in towns all over the Midwest and later other places. And, he'll be there for a couple months and then he'll pack up and move somewhere else. So in 1903, Christmas Eve, actually, they have a chance to reconnect. And they do so in Chicago, which is where this photograph was taken and where Ed Miller was working at the time. Gus was probably in Chicago because his girlfriend, who later becomes a very famous tattooed woman, was performing at a local dime museum with her sisters. They were acrobats. And I suspect that this photograph was probably taken in that dime museum, but it shows Wagner applying, these tattoos on Ed Miller's back by hand. In this case, the big back piece is the design St. George and the Dragon. And that's the end of Ed Miller's career. He, as a tattooed man, I don't know that he ever performed. He got this full suit of tattoos, and for the rest of his life, he wore a suit and tie to work, worked as an accountant, and did local theater. So he wasn't totally out of show business, but he wasn't displaying his body. Gus Wagner, as many people know, goes on to become a very famous tattoo artist, travels the country, bills himself as the champion hand tattooer, globetrotter, taxidermist. He's a wood carver. He works in punched tin. He does mixed media art, painting skulls with tattoo designs. He did a full range of things. I think today we would probably consider him an outsider artist, because even within the realm of tattooing, which did and does have a certain set of rules, he was bending all of those rules. And so this is a photograph of Gus. The next year in St. Louis, he headed down to the St. Louis World's Fair, where he had a very successful shop, tattooing hundreds of people in a matter of just several months, many hundreds of people. And so I thought I would sort of close with a different group of tattoo material. In addition, to photographs, I'm always sort of keen to pick up printed trade catalogs, artwork, and things of that nature, which are very scarce, particularly the earlier you get. And in tattoo history, American tattoo history, early is 1880, 1890, early 1900s. Not a lot of that material survives. So my personal favorite is this fellow, Frank Howard. Frank Howard was tattooed in Chicago in 1884, although he's a native of Providence. And he quickly becomes one of the most successful tattooed men in America. The following year, his wife gets tattooed. They travel together. Similar to the other attractions we just looked at, he's traveling with all the big shows, appearing at dime museums and carnivals. And he does that until 1904. His last tour with the circus was Barnum and Bailey's international tour, where they traveled the UK and throughout Europe. And so he comes back home 1903, 1904. He retires from tattooing and moves back to New England, back to Boston, opens a tattoo shop on Court Street with another prominent tattoo artist named Ed Smith. And so this is a rare trade catalog from their early tattoo supply business. So in addition to being a famous tattooed man, Howard sort of sets the model for what a tattoo supplier can accomplish. There are lots of tattoo artists who advertise that they sell supplies, designs, inks, needles, machines, but Howard takes it to a new level. And with all of his experience in the show business, he's an excellent marketer and self-promoter. So there's this sort of paper ephemera that survives from this supply business. Now, the insides of these little catalogs are wonderful because it's filled with a list of everything he sold, all the different colors he used, the different types of, the different sizes and dimensions of machines, but also these little design books that he sold. So he and Ed Smith sold these books sometimes they're called travel books today, which are just filled with tattoo designs. And I thought I would show you a couple pages from one of his design books. So again, this was painted by Frank Howard in Boston around 1910. And these are just a couple pages. The imagery is consistent for the most part. Now, Gus Wagner was a bit of an exception, but most other tattoo artists are borrowing from the same design sources. So whether it's Frank Howard design book or a tattoo artist in Los Angeles or Detroit, there's for the most part tattooing the same designs. But these little books give us sort of a record of what those designs were. To sort of wrap this up, I thought I'd show you a couple of other things related to Boston. So Frank Howard dies in 1925, and his legacy is basically inherited by a man named Edward Dad Liberty, who was a Boston tattoo artist. And he also happened to inherit a lot of Howard's personal effects and work effects. So he becomes the sort of new king of tattooing in Boston. He goes on to have 3 sons, Ted, Frank, and Harold, who went by Lefty. And the 3 of them tattooed in Boston's Scollay Square from the 1910s up until 1962. This is, all 4 of them tattooed in Boston, Ed and his 3 sons. This is just an example of a early business card. This dates to about 1930. This belonged to one of Dad Liberty's sons, Frank Liberty. He taught all of his sons how to tattoo, and each of them opened shops in Scollay Square. So they weren't, occasionally they might be in the same shop, but for the most part, they were tattooing in different studios in the same place. So basically they held a monopoly on tattooing in the city. A lot of artists would come and go over the years, but no one really stuck around because the Liberties had such a stronghold there. And then I thought I would close with this, which visually probably is not it's probably the least interesting thing I've showed you tonight visually, but historically it's important. This is a letter from the Boston Redevelopment Authority from 1961 to Harold Liberty, Lefty Liberty. He was one of Dad's sons, Ed Liberty's sons, and he was the last person, not just Liberty, but the last person to run a tattoo shop in Boston. So this is a letter from the authority telling him, you know, you have to get out. We're taking over your property by eminent domain, and they would soon tear it down and redevelop that whole part of Scollay Square as government center. So I know I raced through a lot there rather quickly, but that kind of gives you a sense for the type of material that has been near and dear to my heart for a long time. And I'm really grateful to Historic New England for giving me the chance to talk to you about it tonight. And I'm also really thrilled to have been recognized for this prize. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Derin. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. We now turn to the 2020 Historic New England Book Prize. The book prize was created with 2 goals in mind. First, to recognize significant publications that advance the understanding of New England's architecture, landscape, and material culture, which includes works in the decorative arts, archaeology, historic preservation, the history of photography, and other related subjects. And second, to underscore Historic New England's commitment to the scholarship of the region. For this year's prize, the Book Prize Committee carefully evaluated 22 titles, considering new scholarship, fresh perspectives, and accessibility to a broad and diverse audience. After thoughtful deliberation, the committee selected the books that we honor tonight. I want to thank the committee members for their hard work this year, including Pam Fox, Paula Laverty, Susan Maycock, Tom Mickey, Tim Rohan, Chloe Tepper, Lorna Condon, and Diane Vieira. And now for the first Honor Book Award. The committee selected the paintings of J.O.J. Frost, An American Story by Bethe Lee Moulton, as one of this year's honor books. In this captivating volume, Moulton tells the remarkable story of the Marblehead, Massachusetts painter, J.O.J. Frost, who lived from 1852 to 1928. Thank you, Beth. It is customary for book prize committee members to write reviews of the books under consideration. Tonight, I want you to hear directly from a member of the committee about why he was so impressed with this book. I quote, "The story of the rise, fall, and recovery of Frost's artistic output and legacy is a remarkable tale. A self-taught painter who took up a paintbrush at the age of 70, Frost was prolific, if not commercially successful. Bethe Moulton has succeeded. I wanted to call you Bethe Moulton Frost for a moment there. Bethe Moulton has succeeded in compiling the artist's biography, documenting his surviving work, and recording the saga of Frost's bequest to the Marblehead Historical Society." Another committee member commented that this meticulously researched book will have great appeal to a broad audience. It is my pleasure to present Bethe Moulton with a 2020 Honor Book Award. Beth.
Well, thank you, Vin, and thank you for this award. I'm imagining you're passing it to me. It is amazing to be recognized by this society that is New England at its finest. And I am really, really thrilled to be introducing you to J.O.J. Frost, a national treasure who is hardly known outside of Marblehead, Massachusetts. So I now will take a moment to share my screen. And off we will go. This book was possible because of the generosity of many individuals and institutions. They shared their images, their memories, and their archives. One of those institutions was Historic New England, and I want to thank Lorna Condon and her staff for their critical role in the research you're about to hear about. I also share this award with my mother, Priscilla Moulton, whose passion and vision are the force behind this scavenger hunt. Here she is viewing a painting at the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York, a painting by Frost, and she's wondering what happened to the head of Colonel Glover's horse. I must also mention the Marblehead Museum, home of the largest collection of Frost paintings. Although we worked independently, the Marblehead Museum encouraged our work in countless ways. I urge you to visit its J.O.J. Frost Gallery. Open to the public year-round, it's a very, very special place. And now meet John Orne Johnson Frost, a man who started to paint in his 70s. He reminds us that it is never too late to leave a legacy. This endearing and enduring artist was driven to depict the history of his hometown, Marblehead, Massachusetts, its perilous fishing industry, and the heroic deeds of its citizens. Frost wanted future generations to remember those who built our nation through hard work and brave deeds. His story pictures, like this one, that's the ship's bells in honor of J.O.J. His story pictures were ridiculed as childish. There weren't any buyers, but he was undeterred. With his own hands, he built the backyard museum you see here with the flag, and his art piled up there until he died in 1928. It could have all just gone to the trash, and this would be my presentation. However, his only living son, Frank Frost, gave 70 paintings to the Marblehead Historical Society. About 30 of those you can see at the Marblehead Museum today. Marblehead Museum is the renamed MHS. What happened to the rest? That is the story, that is the story that Mother and I wanted to answer. And we wanted to lift the shadows that seemed to hang over Frost's paintings decades after his death. We pieced together a saga with twists and turns. There are lost paintings, unexpected discoveries of paintings, even a dramatic court case. In what seemed to be parochial events, we discovered timeless human sentiments and widespread institutional dilemmas. And I'm happy to say we found no wrongdoing surrounding the paintings, just some very strong advocates, sometimes with different interests. Those champions saved JOJ's work from the trash heap. I'm having a panic here because this is not the sequence that we should be talking about. Okay, let me go back here. So JOJ, sorry. So one of those advocates was Nina Fletcher Little. Her daughter organized the papers that are in the Historic New England archives. Nina Fletcher Little's papers provided very important evidence for one piece of the Frost mystery story that I'll share with you now. In a nutshell, in the early 50s, when the Frost homestead that you see here was sold by his heirs, it was in bad shape. The new owners, the Masons, started to renovate, and they found pictures inside the studs of the house. One of those pictures is this one, the one we saw at the opening. This is how it looked coming down off the walls, dirty and even cut apart. In fact, if we look here, this is the restored painting as we know it today, overlaid on top of the original painting painted by J.O.J. Frost. This is the condition in which multiple paintings were found. Those paintings were put together, restored, put together like a jigsaw puzzle by Charles Childs of Childs Gallery in Boston. The historic wallboards were put up for sale at a moment when folk art was having a heyday. Before the sale opened, Nina Fletcher Little was invited by Childs to see the paintings. She chose several for herself, including this one, also the crossing of the Delaware that we saw before. She also, by the way, owns some Frost sculptures, carvings, which can be seen at Cogswell Grant in Essex, Massachusetts. But more importantly, Nina Fletcher Little influenced other collectors who eventually gave their Frost paintings to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Colonial Williamsburg, Peabody Essex Museum. This was also one of Nina's pictures, by the way, and the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York. Letters and photographs in your archives allowed us to know for certain that 18 of the paintings found in the home of the Masons, the former home of Frost, had originally been given as a gift to the Marblehead Historical Society. The photographs combined with other documents that we found elsewhere. One of the 18 belongs to Historic New England. This is Phillips House in Salem, Massachusetts, and we're viewing the hardships and self-sacrifice, Massey's Cove, Salem, 1626. Stephen Phillips was a friend of the Masons, a personal friend, and bought this directly from the Masons. Mother and I realized we had the makings of a comprehensive book about J.O.J. Frost. Our book designer, Amy Drinker, who's here tonight, thank you, Amy, converted our research into this beautiful volume. Frost paintings have been reunited as never before. Readers of all ages can delight in his details and see his paintings that are literally hidden away in private collections or museum vaults. The paintings you just saw are not on display in the museums for the most part. During our pre-COVID book launch, you can see here, JOJ was quite pleased with this situation. Frost wanted future generations to remember and honor our forefathers who shaped this nation's history. Through this recognition, Historic New England is honoring them. We hope this visual legacy will delight and inspire many generations to come. This book makes a wonderful holiday gift for a whole family, whether it's little ones or grandparents. I hope at some point we will have this on sale post-COVID at a New England, Historic New England site or two. You will not find it on Amazon. Please go to the marbleheadmuseum.org, visit the gift shop, and every penny of your purchase will support the museum. Once again, I thank you for this honor, and your recognition will definitely help us expand the circle of Frost fans. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much for sharing J.O.J. Frost's story with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now for the second honor book award. The book prize committee named Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places by Christopher Wigren of Preservation, Connecticut, formerly known as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, as a 2020 honor book. This volume uses a wide variety of Connecticut residential, commercial, and ecclesiastical buildings and landscapes to tell stories about the state. Arranged thematically, the book catalogs 100 examples of Connecticut buildings and places shaped by humans from the 17th to the 21st centuries. A book prize committee member commented, "The choice of subjects is excellent. The scope includes examples for different classes, functions, and topographies. 20th century office parks are given as much attention as high-end colonial houses." Another member of the committee wrote, "What the book does beautifully is to engage the reader in looking at a wide variety of Connecticut places in new ways and celebrates Connecticut's diverse inventory of fascinating buildings and places." It is now my pleasure to present Christopher Wigren with the 2020 Honor Book Award. Chris.
Thank you, Van. Thank you so much. Coming from Historic New England with its long, distinguished history, its so many contributions to the knowledge and appreciation and preservation of historic places in New England, this is a great honor. I really became acquainted with the organization 30 years ago when I had a chance to tag along through some colonial houses in Connecticut behind Abbot Lowell Cummings, who at that point was teaching at Yale, but spoke often about what he had done and learned while he was the director of what was then the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And Carissa Demore is always a great resource for my work in preservation easements. So thank you so much for this. Let me see if I can, I'm supposed to hold up my book. But let me shift to the power, oh, let's see. Share screen. Okay, this book was created as part of my work for Preservation Connecticut, or formerly the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, the statewide nonprofit preservation organization. In the course of our work, my colleagues and I discovered that there was no single good source to talk to people about historic architecture, which we spend a lot of time trying to discuss and help people to understand and appreciate. And the architecture that we cover is a wide range. My definition of it is really making places. So that it covers individual buildings. It also covers groups of buildings like campuses and neighborhoods, landscapes, engineering structures like bridges and dams, and even interiors, which sometimes are created independently of the buildings in which they're housed. So we decided that it was time for me to write a book to tell the story of Connecticut's architecture through 100 selected works. These are not necessarily the best examples. They're not the most famous by a long shot. There are a lot of things that aren't included, but it's an assortment that together begins to sketch a history of Connecticut's built environment. It was written with 3 goals in mind. First, to express the variety of Connecticut architecture, that it's much more than the colonial houses that come first to mind for most people. Second, to help expand some ideas about what to look at in architecture, what questions to ask of it, more than just slapping the label of one particular style on a building and then going on. And of course, an important goal was to build appreciation, to make the case for historic preservation. As the description said, the book is 100 entries that are sorted by topics. Some of the topics are building types. Some of them are about people, the designers, builders, clients, even developers who determine what is built and where and how. The meanings and messages embodied in architecture as a work of art, and stories of how buildings change over time and how those changes reflect the changing lives of the people who live in them. Perhaps the best way to give you a flavor of the book is to read one of those 100 brief entries. So this is about a place in Bridgeport called Seaside Village. The title of the story is Unnecessary Excellence. A pocket of tranquility where colonial-style brick houses line winding tree-shaded streets, Seaside Village is the largest of the projects constructed in Connecticut by the United States Housing Corporation, USHC, to accommodate munitions workers during World War I. Even before the United States entered the war, Bridgeport's armaments factories were hiring thousands of new workers to supply the European belligerents. Between 1914 and 1916, the city's population grew by 50%. In response to the resulting housing crisis, the Chamber of Commerce formed the Bridgeport Housing Company in 1916, which was superseded in 1918 by the United States Housing Corporation. Between them, the two organizations built 7 complexes in Bridgeport, as well as one each in neighboring Fairfield and Stratford. Led by a team of nationally known architects, landscape architects, and planners, the USHC was driven by an ambitious long-range goal to provide models for post-war construction that would transform the way American cities were built. Drawing on the Garden City movement and on privately constructed model industrial housing, they created complexes that were sturdily built, carefully detailed, attractively laid out, and landscaped. After the war, this level of quality drew charges of unnecessary excellence in congressional hearings. One congressman actually said that. But on the eve of World War II, national journals were still citing these projects, including Seaside Village, as models of good housing design. A major challenge was to make the developments of small, relatively uniform structures varied and attractive. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., manager of the USHC's Town Planning Division, outlined principles to address this concern in an article he wrote in 1919. These included relatively short streets with curves to block long views, avoiding rigid symmetry or balance, which would create an institutional appearance, and also avoiding too much variety, which could look like a stage set rather than a real neighborhood. In keeping with Olmsted's principles, landscape architect Arthur Shurtleff arranged the houses of Seaside Village along gently winding streets, or clustered them around grassy courts. Some of the bends in the streets were planned to save existing trees. The houses themselves, designed by architects R. Clipston Sturgis and Andrew Hepburn, are broken down into small units on an intimate scale. Flemish bond brickwork and Georgian-inspired trim suggest Virginia. Interestingly, Hepburn's firm later served as the restoration architects for colonial Williamsburg, beginning in the 1920s. In Seaside Village, we see that he was aware of Virginia architecture a decade before. After the war, the USHC sold Seaside Village to a cooperative association in which residents own a share of the total development rather than a specific unit. This gave them a stake in the property's future and helped ensure its continued maintenance. Thanks to resident ownership and the quality of its design and construction, Seaside Village shows that affordable housing can be humane and attractive and retain its value long after other so-called model housing has deteriorated into slums. So I hope that this book will not only inform readers, but inspire them to get out and explore on their own, to look for architecture. It's all around you, wherever you go in New England, and find what you can discover in your own neighborhood, in your own town, in your own communities. I really owe a great debt of thanks to Preservation Connecticut for giving me the opportunity, the time, the resources to create this book. I thank my colleagues for all the helpful suggestions and critiques they gave me in the process, and for pulling some of the slack of other jobs that I might have been doing if I weren't writing a book. And again, I want to thank Historic New England for this great honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was absolutely wonderful. And to our many friends with us from Connecticut tonight, and I know there are several of you, welcome. And now for the Historic New England Book Prize Award. The Historic New England Book Prize Committee was unanimous in its praise for the Atlas of Boston History, edited by Nancy S. Seasholes. This extraordinary volume traces Boston's history from the last ice age to the present through well-researched and well-written texts and amazing maps and supporting images. I will let a book prize committee member extol the book's virtues. I quote, "This is a remarkable book, vast in conceptual scope and large in physical presence. It is a folio volume. 35 authors contributed texts that accompany 57 maps that trace Boston's geological, ethnological, archaeological, political, literary, artistic, educational, recreational, industrial, economic, demographic, technological, and social history from the last ice age to the present. I honestly could not put it down because I found the combination of topics, colorful maps, and support illustrations endlessly fascinating," end quote. Another committee member noted, "It is the sort of book that a reader can go back to time and again with a focus each time of something new." This book perfectly fits the Historic New England Book Prize criteria. It is now my pleasure to present the 2020 Historic New England Book Prize to Nancy S. Seasholes.
Thank you so much, Finn. I really appreciate it. I think everybody wants to see this great oversized
Absolutely.
book. Very large, but very reasonably priced, actually. So let me turn on my share screen and get started. If I can find, let's see if this is going to work. No, it is not. Claire, let's go back here and see what we can do. Okay, now share screen. Nuts. Claire, it wasn't working when I tried the share screen. Let's go back. Okay, I'm clicking on it and it's not working. I'll try something else. Okay, let's try this. There we go. Okay, That's what I wanted you to see. So first of all, not only thank you, Vin, but I am so honored that this atlas has won the Historic New England Book Prize. But I have to say, I was very surprised that it was eligible. When I read all those specs that you named in the first place, especially the one about material culture, I thought it wouldn't qualify. So I didn't even suggest to the University of Chicago Press, which published it, that they submit it for consideration. Fortunately, Lorna took it upon herself to add it to the books that were under consideration. And as I said, I'm very honored that you all liked it so much. What-
Nancy, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, we can't see your PowerPoint. We're just seeing the.
Oh, nuts. Well, what am I going to do? Let's go back to share screen. Let me get back to where I'm supposed to be with you all. Okay. I am having troubles with this. Okay. Share
Stop your
screen.
sharing.
Yeah. Now
Make sure you have the PowerPoint up and then
I
choose
do.
that. Okay,
I
now
do.
try that.
I have. Okay.
Okay, now you're good. Now start the slideshow.
Now can you
Yes.
see it?
Yes.
Okay. So you heard what I had to say about I was surprised that the atlas even was eligible. Did you all hear that? Claire?
Yes, we heard it. We just couldn't see the
Okay.
screen. It was all. It's
Okay.
fine.
All
You can
right.
start from there.
Okay. So what is this Atlas of Boston history? Well, it's an historical atlas of Boston, one that, as Vin just said, traces Boston's history from the last of the Ice Age to the present through maps. And in our case, maps that were drafted especially for it by a team of cartographers. Just to give you some idea of what I'm talking about, here is the first map in the atlas. As you know, in an atlas, maps are generally arranged in double-page spreads called plates. So this first plate is the one about the last of the Ice Age, and it shows that Boston, which is right here, is located in a geological formation called the Boston Basin that extends from Lynn on the north to Wellesley on the west to Quincy on the south. During that last Ice Age, the Boston Basin was completely covered with a big sheet of ice, very deep. And that is what we're trying to show here. This is a photo of the Boston Basin taken from Belmont Hill, right up here. And on that, we've superimposed what the depth of the ice would have been. 4,000 feet thick, almost a mile thick of ice. So we go from this point to the last plate, which is Boston in 2010. The year chosen because this was the last federal census that we had available to us. And here our map shows different groups that lived in Boston in 2010. Each dot represents 50 people. The blue are whites, yellow are blacks, green are Hispanics, and purple are Asians. Down here we have a graph that shows the division of Boston among these groups. Boston's now what is called a majority-minority city, meaning minorities are in the majority, whites are in the minority. So people have asked, where did this project get started? How did you get going on it? Well, I have to confess, it was my own idea. Even back in the 90s, when we were working on mapping Boston, I was interested in having an historical atlas of Boston. And then when I was working on my own major book about land making in Boston, I kept wishing that there was one place I could go to for maps of, say, the water system, the sewerage system, railroads, population figures. So as soon as I finished the land making book and a companion book of walking tours, I began working on the atlas. I invited a group of historians who write on Boston history to meet to discuss it. They all thought it was a good idea, and we met periodically from 2007 to 2010 to discuss what should be in the atlas, finally in 2010 coming up with a table of contents. Then we had to decide who was going to author which plates. The members of the steering committee had a lot of expertise in many of the topics we'd chosen, but not all. So we went out and looked for more authors. And as one of these comments said, we ended up with 35 different authors of Atlas plates. So just to give you some idea of what we're talking about, I thought I would just show you some sample plates from the Atlas as an example of what's in it. At intervals in the Atlas, we have plates on Boston in a specific year. Most of the maps on these plates are drawn by our cartographers, but occasionally we've used historical maps, such as this one. This is the 1800 map of Boston by Osgood Carleton. Now we know that people have trouble relating a map like this to Boston of today, so we provide a locator map. And here is the 1800 Carleton map on a modern map of Boston, just to show the relation. Our plates about Boston in a specific year generally show where people lived and the groups into which they were divided. Gale Sawtelle, who's the author of this plate, did a very good job of combining data from the 1800 Boston Directory, the 1800 tax-taking books, with property owners marked by Samuel Clough on his maps for 1798 to identify all residences in Boston in 1800. She found that there was more residential segregation than had previously been thought. To take the elite, who are all these purple houses, in the 18th century, the elite had been mostly concentrated in the North End. But Gale found that in 1800, they were concentrated in the Bowdoin Square area of the West End, and also following the construction of the Tontine Crescent in the Old South End in 1796, along various streets in the Old South End. Blue dots represent Blacks, and her research confirmed that there was a large enclave of Black settlement on the north slope of Beacon Hill. This is Cambridge Street. This is what became Mount Vernon Street. So this is the north slope. She also found that another major occupational group were housewrights, who are shown with green dots, and that they tended to locate in areas of new housing, and new houses are shown with these dark green houses. So she found certain concentrations of new house building in the West End, in the Old South End, and near the Neck. Our plates about Boston in a specific year generally include what we call an architectural sidebar, focusing on the predominant architectural style of the time. In this case, of course, federal architecture. We generally illustrate a public building, in this case, the new State House, designed by Bulfinch. For an upper middle class house, we've chosen the first Harrison Gray Otis House, also designed by Bulfinch, which is, of course, the headquarters of historic New England. I should have mentioned, we try to use just houses that are still standing. So for the middle class house, we've chosen a frame house called the Nell House that's on the north slope at 3 Smith Court. This is another plate about Boston in a specific year. This is 1855. The data came from the Massachusetts State Census of population for that year, and it showed that US-born whites were still the predominant group in Boston, but that foreign-born were becoming increasingly important, particularly the Irish, which are shown, not surprisingly, in green. Our map shows where these groups lived in Boston. The data were collected by ward, so we have a graph for the population of each ward. The different sizes of the graphs are because of the differences in populations among the wards. So as you can see, most of the wards, in most wards, US-born whites were still the predominant group, except in places like Ward 7, which is where Fort Hill was, where the Irish were very dominant, or predominant, I should say. And over here, this yellow wedge is for Blacks. And Ward 6 included the north slope of Beacon Hill, and that enclave of Black residences continued to be on the north slope during all of the 19th century. Our architectural sidebar is about Italianate architecture. The public building is the State Street block. This is the way it looked when it was built, which is very different from the way it looks today. The roof has been changed, and also the whole eastern half has been truncated in the 1950s for the building of the Central Artery. The upper middle class house is a townhouse on Beacon Street in Back Bay, and the middle class house is a frame house on Meridian Street in East Boston. This map points out a very important feature of the maps in the atlas, and that is that we tried to keep the shorelines of all of the maps in the atlas accurate for the date of that plate. In other words, this is not the modern shoreline of Boston, it's the 1855 shoreline. As you can see here, this is an 1855 map superimposed on a modern map of Boston. The difference between the two is all the land making that's occurred between 1855 and the present. So we were always looking for accurate historical maps that our cartographers could use to recreate these historical shorelines. In this case, the shoreline is heavily based on this 1852 map of Boston by Henry McIntyre. We have a number of plates in the atlas about the development of the infrastructure and public transportation. This is a plate I worked on with Charlie Bainey. These maps show the expansion of the streetcar system from the horse cars, which began in 1856, up to 1888, and then the huge expansion of streetcars once they began to be electrified in 1888. These are the streetcar lines up until 1918. On this side, we show the beginnings of the subway system. The first subway in Boston, and in fact, in all of the Americas, was the Park Street subway, which opened in 1897. It was soon followed by a rapid transit elevated line on Washington Street in the South End in Roxbury, on Atlantic Avenue around the Boston Peninsula, and then on Main Street in Charlestown. Through the downtown Boston, it ran through a tunnel, which is where the Orange Line still runs today. The third of these subways to open was what was called a streetcar subway. It was the forerunner of today's Blue Line. Streetcar subway meaning there were streetcars which ran on city streets and then down into a subway and then out again onto city streets. The Blue Line didn't become a rapid transit line until 1924. So the subways ran in a tunnel that was dug for them especially under the harbor to East Boston. And here in this postcard, you can see the streetcar emerging in Meridian Square in East Boston. The last of these subway lines to open was the forerunner of today's Red Line, and it was a rapid transit train, much as it is today. It opened in 1912. This is a plate by that shows the movement of cultural institutions, things like museums, libraries, and the like, generally following trends to fashionable neighborhoods. It's by Jay Wickersham, who's both an architect and a lawyer. So, as we found, cultural institutions followed their clientele as they moved from one neighborhood to another. Those founded in the late 18th century, those were the earliest ones, which are shown with the purple dots. Some of them were located near the Tontine Crescent, which was very fashionable at the time. Then, excuse me, in the early 19th century, when the center of gravity shifted to the Common, cultural institutions moved too, shown with the blue dots. Then, after the Civil War, when this area became a business district and Back Bay was being developed as a fashionable neighborhood, many cultural institutions relocated then, shown with the red dots. And then finally, at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Fens area was being developed, a number of cultural institutions relocated then too, in two arms, as Jay has pointed out, some on the Fens itself and others along Huntington Avenue. This whole process culminating, he feels, in 1909 with the building of the third MFA at a place where the Fens and Huntington Avenue intersected. And actually the MFA has two entrances. This is the entrance on the Fens, and there's also a Huntington Avenue entrance. An institution like the Mass Historical Society, which moved to its present location on the Fens in 1899, was actually in its 7th home. And you can find the other 6 on this map in its peregrinations around Boston and some of the other institutions also. This is a plate by Susan Wilson, which shows women's enterprises mostly in the second part of the 19th century. Some of them were famous women like Isabella Stewart Gardner and Fanny Farmer, and some not so well known like Julia Paget, who ran the Swan Boat concession after her husband had died just 1 year after it had opened in 1877. And actually the Paget family still runs the Swan Boats. I just love this photo of an early swan boat. And actually it comes from the Historic New England collection. This is a plate by Jim Vrabel about the busing crisis in the 1970s. Our map shows census tracts that have more than 50% of a single race, of one race. So green are whites, yellow and orange are blacks, and some on Columbia Point here, and purple are Chinese. The only census tracts that did not have more than 50% of a given race were these right here in gray. The black dots are the schools. So given the fact that the blacks were located in this central corridor, and then some on Columbia Point, you can see the difficulty of devising any plan that would integrate all of the Boston schools. As we know, the plan that was devised involved a great deal of busing and aroused a great deal of opposition. This is a photo in December 1974 in front of Hyde Park High. Here are whites demonstrating against Black students being bused in. And our penultimate plate is about environmental problems, particularly rising sea level, which has become so critical with climate change. It's by Stephanie Krull, who's an environmental planner at, let me see if I can get it right, VBH. I hope I've got it right. In any case, what she shows here are areas that would be flooded given the amount of sea level rise. And we put in the original shoreline because the areas that would be flooded are so congruent with areas of made land. So I have shown you just very briefly some of the plates in the atlas, and I hope given you some idea of the types of things that it covers. So that is all I had to say about it.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Absolutely fascinating and an extraordinary project and a tremendous contribution and a gift. So thank you so much. Once again, I want to acknowledge the outstanding contributions of our collector and authors and to thank the committees. It has been a pleasure to spend time with you this evening. I look forward to seeing you at next year's Night of Prizes, hopefully in person. Thank you and happy holidays.